So what you're about to listen to is an interview we have done with probably one of the most controversial and outspoken members of the anti-doping community. His name is Travis T. Tygart, the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Anti-Doping Agency. And there's a couple of things we're going to cover in this quite extensive interview where we talk about not only the ongoing feud with WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, but all of the different aspects of this very complex and very important part of world sport. And you could argue that why should we care this much about doping? But the reason why we do care about it so much about doping, and you'll hear it in the way that Travis describes his mandate as an anti-doping part of this anti-doping community, in that anti-doping makes sure that the sport that we watch is as legitimate and as real as we want it and can be, because every time there is an athlete out there that dopes, it means there is an athlete that potentially loses because of that. So it is a critical part of what we watch, that we assume that everybody that is lining up at the start of an Olympic Games or a Tour de France or any other sporting event, that they are competing on a level playing field in terms of the fact that they are clean athletes, and that is why it is so important. To give you some background to Travis Tygart, he's been the Chief Executive Officer since 2007, so almost 22 years. He was also served as the Director of Legal Affairs and as Senior Managing Director and General Counsel at USADA. He's a lawyer by training. And under Tygart's leadership, USADA has investigated the international steroid bust Operation Raw Deal and the international doping conspiracy involving the Balco laboratory in San Francisco. He also led the investigation into the U.S. Postal Service Pro Cycling Team. And of course, many of you will know the case of Lance Armstrong, which was one of his big successes in the way that he prosecuted Lance Armstrong. Tygart has also had international effort, also led to an international effort to advocate for justice and reform in the aftermath of the Russian state-sponsored doping scheme. And this led to the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Fraud Act, which you'll get to hear a bit more about that in the podcast, which was a landmark new law brought into the States that criminalizes international doping fraud and allows prosecutors to effectively change not just the people that take doping substances, but those that actually organize that as well. He serves on the board of directors for the Sports Lawyers Association, on the board of governors for the Partnership for Clean Competition. He was named as the 50 most powerful people in Sports Illustrated before, and was also named on Time 100's list of most influential people in 2013. So this is a man, Ross Tucker, who has a lot of credibility in terms of some aspects of anti-doping. We won't ask WADA what they think of him, but he's a man who talks with a huge amount of passion about this. But a lot of the things he says, you have to understand the background of what he's talking about.
Yeah, Tygart is a guy who, when he speaks, it's a headline.
Yeah.
And I'd never heard him speak. You'd interviewed him more than 10 years ago, no? Here in Cape Town. I'd not heard him, well, I'd heard him speak. Of course, I'd heard him speak, but not spoken to him like this. And the thing that struck me initially is like how charismatic and energetic he is. I didn't expect that. But you can see that he's forceful and he's passionate and he's fully committed to the principles that he believes are necessary in anti-doping. And we went into this interview more, I think, is it fair to say, interested in asking about how anti-doping works and where we are in the battle. And we weren't necessarily going to pursue some of the questions around WADA that have been in the headlines. Listeners will know we've covered a couple times in the last 12 months. But that is where it went. And the challenge then is that there's a lot of assumed prior knowledge. So when Tygart explains things and his views on where anti-doping is failing versus succeeding, you have to know a little bit about that. So it becomes quite a complex interview to follow in the absence of that historical context and background.
So the reason why we're going to do things slightly differently from what we normally do with the podcast. Now, normally what we would do, we would introduce our guest as we are doing now, and then we would go in to the interview. But what we're going to do in our interview with Travis is that when it comes to some of these contextual bits of background, we're going to stop the interview with him and then just kind of come across and explain a little bit what he's talking about, so that for you as a listener, you can understand exactly what he's saying and understand some of the acronyms he uses, because he uses quite a lot of those. We had to look those up ourselves. And for us, when we were listening to this interview after we actually finished watching it, listening to it again, we kind of felt that this was necessary, because even we had to listen to it twice to really understand what he was saying a lot of the time. So it's very important to listen very closely and to understand some of the very important points that he makes and understand the context of that. So I hope you will enjoy our interview with Travis Tygart and understand that our little interruptions halfway through at multiple times during the actual interview is just to give you the context of what he is talking about. Travis, welcome to the Science of Sport. Real privilege to have you on. And we were talking about what your place is in the world of world sports doping. And Ross suggested that you were perhaps the sheriff of world doping because you've been embroiled in lots of controversies, but you've also been probably one of the most outspoken people in the world of doping. Do you see yourself as that kind of person? How do you see yourself in this global doping scene?
No, well, not at all. And, Ron, we're starting already with the provocative questions, about from Ross's perspective. But no, listen, not at all. I assume that's a compliment, and I'll hope that that's a compliment. But listen, we are here to do right by athletes, and I think the passion to stand up for athletes has driven us from the very beginning. And we try to have an Olympic mindset around here that we should be, skeptical of the systems that athletes are held to, and they're very high standards. And athletes, we know, we've done surveys that show they're anxious in this system because it puts a lot of pressure on them. And that's incredibly unfortunate. And so if we're going to do that to athletes, we have to make sure that we're delivering on the promise as well. And I see a lot of failures in that regard. And, the Olympic mindset says, we're going to review film, right? We have to win a gold medal in anti-doping because that's what athletes who are doing it the right way are relying on us to do. So listen, part of it is longevity. I've been doing this for basically my career. I do love it because, it's important values, and athletes deserve, those that are going to fight in the trenches for them. It's complicated. It's difficult. There's a lot of, technical science, law, investigations. You overlay, unfortunately, some of the politics that have gotten in the way over the past few years at the global level. So it's not an easy position to do, but it's incredibly satisfying when athletes are relying on you and they trust you and your organization to have their back and deliver ultimately on the promise to allow them just to put their head down and go and do what they do, which is to train and be the best in the world and represent their countries, their families, their friends in the right way.
Just give us an idea of the mandate of USADA in terms of what your job is. I mean, you've been there for over 20 years now, and how you see that playing out in the global perspective, because obviously the role of USADA has moved beyond just the borders of the United States.
Yeah, listen, I think we are, there's a misunderstanding around the world. And WADA, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, but they're really trying to exploit this difference. In the U.S., there is no sports minister. It's not under any government organization. It's all independent and by contract. So our jurisdiction comes by contract with athletes who have, a license to compete, whether it's a weekend race like the New York Marathon that they're a weekend warrior of, or they're a pro level or elite level athlete and have a year license. But it's all basically through contract. So it's a unique system compared to pretty much all the other Olympic, competing countries who have government jurisdiction over athletes who are required to follow the WADA code. Ours are not. You can compete in sport that's not covered by the WADA code because the government doesn't mandate it.
So, Ross, this is an interesting differentiation between a lot of the major members of WADA in the fact that the American system means that they are literally only covering certain sports, and lots of sports within the American sporting system are not governed or even use USADA in terms of testing athletes for doping offences.
Yeah, and I think the bit that he mentions where there's a misunderstanding, that it's not, I wouldn't say it's a sensitive point, but it comes up quite often when people want to be critical of US anti-doping in general, because all the professional sports in the US, so that's NFL, NHL, Major League Baseball, NBA, etc., and the NCAA, which is their college system, and arguably the world's richest pipeline of talent, because almost all Olympic athletes are coming through that college system. those are not under USADA jurisdiction. So the USADA jurisdiction is athletes and sports that agree to be under its jurisdiction. In Norway, in England, here in South Africa, etc., it's different because the sport is, the anti-doping agency is funded by the government. And so if you're a sport in these countries, you are under jurisdiction. So when he talks about contract and agreements, that's effectively what he's referring to there. So every Olympic code going to the Winter Olympics next year, or that we're in Summer Olympics in 2024, they are signatories, if in effect, with USADA, and that's why USADA can go to track and field, snowboarding, swimming, etc., and test those athletes. But there are some athletes they don't have access to. That's the point.
So the good side of that is there is a level of independence, I guess?
Yeah, exactly. That's the upside, is that they can effectively not be reliant on government funding. Now, that's maybe not always good.
So where is funding coming from?
Got to find that funding elsewhere. So the funding comes from the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Wouldn't give you a percentage because I'd be guessing. Contracts with sports organizations, grants and donations. In South Africa, for instance, our Olympic Committee has to give SAIDS all its funding, and I think it works similar to that everywhere else. So because it's independent, there's in theory no political influence. They can investigate without government oversight.
And I suppose the downside is that there are other sports within the American system which have their own testing teams and protocols, but there's slight question marks as to how reliable those are when you talk about those professional sports in the States.
Yeah, and that's why, like in the NFL, you'll see sometimes athletes been tested for steroids. They get a 4-game ban and a hefty financial fine. And the Olympic sports will have a good chuckle about that because they say, look how seriously these guys are taking it. But they're so separate that there's almost no concern. I mean, of course, there's a concern for them. Where I think it's a concern is when the NCAA is the feeder system into the Olympic sports, because up to the age of 22, 23, you sort of have no sight of an athlete who at 24 wins an Olympic medal for them. So that's the criticism they get, and that's the potential weakness.
Our mission for sure is to, handle our domestic program, and that is a job in and of itself. And listen, I came in early 2000 when the U.S. had, I think, one of the dirtiest reputations around the world because it was the fox guarding the hen house. You had the Olympic Committee and then each national federation. There was the infamous 13 cases out of track and field that were supposedly covered up by the system at that time in the U.S. We were winning the 96 games, a lot of world championships, and the perception was the U.S. is the dirtiest because the system is so bad.
So this was a fairly dark time for American sports, and these 13 athletes, including the then world champion in the 400 meters, Jerome Young, was one of those 13 athletes that was bust. And I think it was kind of almost the conduit to the establishment of USADA to really knuckle down on looking after their own athletes.
Yeah, certainly their purpose. And actually the 13 were part of an even bigger group because the big scandal was that the guy who was the head of drug control at the USOC, that's the US Olympic Committee. Yeah. The fox in Travis Tygart's retelling of it was a guy called Dr. Wade Exum, and he made claims that there were over 100 positive tests covered up from 1988 all the way to 2000. And then when he resigned, there was another statement that about 50% of positive tests under his watch resulted in no sanction. And the 13 were among those. And USADA basically then starts in October 2000. So when Tygart talks about a watershed and then the beginning of USADA, this is the historical event that he was referring to.
So, we spent those early years building our system, literally went from 2 employees to where we are today, very limited funding, year-to-year funding, to try to build the system that we have. And the only reason, following probably the Balco cases or the Floyd Landis cases or the Armstrong case, and for sure, that this sort of global attention, I guess, if that's how you want to characterize it, is because we did the right thing for athletes, even when it was a high profile, very complicated set of athletes. Someone overseas one time told me when the U.S. decides to do something right, they go all in and do it right. And we're not perfect by any stretch, and we have a lot of things to improve, and we need more resources and more money and more staff to, truly win the fight in the way that we're doing it. But listen, if we're the underdogs, we're gonna fight above our weight, and we're gonna do everything we can to give confidence to athletes. But here's the international piece of this: is if we're doing everything we're doing and truly making an effort to send only a clean team to international competition, and then they get robbed, like the Chinese cases, 23 positive tests that the rules weren't applied to. That resulted in 96 medals potentially being impacted around the world, 18 of which were U.S. medals. 14 of the 18 were gold medals in swimming.
So this is one of the most contentious issues between USADA and WADA, and this was the case of the 23 Chinese swimmers that were found to have tested positive for a banned substance, but then eventually were allowed to compete at the 2021 Olympic Games, being the 2020 Games because they were delayed. But it was really one of the issues that kind of started this feud between USADA and WADA. And what was the background of that? That's complicated.
So this is... this is ground zero for what's currently going on. Basically, very early in 2021, at a national domestic swimming event, 23 swimmers tested positive for this drug called TMZ, trimetazidine, which is heart medication used in the East. It's come up in Russian athletes as well, but basically it's banned because it's thought to enhance blood flow and endurance, right? So there's a reason it would be banned. Those athletes tested positive, and what subsequently emerged only months later is that USADA, which is Chinese anti-doping agency, USADA's equivalent in China, were slow to act on it. Now, we'll discuss later with Travis, and we've heard many times that contamination is a risk. So there's always an anti-doping case. There's a question of contamination. Is that the source? What seems to have happened here is that the samples were sent to a laboratory in Beijing. That lab took 2 months to inform WADA of the positive test results. 2 months means that any source of contamination is probably long gone. So the ability of the Chinese anti-doping agency to investigate contamination claims looks very dubious at best. What eventually transpires is that USADA believes that it was contamination in a hotel kitchen. Now, WADA then, for its part, this happens in about March, April of 2021, so 2 months after the test. WADA launches at that stage, before this is publicly known, their first review. It's kind of a technical, scientific review of what the Chinese are saying. So they get experts involved. They do some sort of pharmacokinetics. You're looking at this stage at the concentration detected in the athletes. Is it plausible that it's contamination? Very importantly, no one's traveling to China because of COVID. So there's no access to the hotel, the kitchen. They are reliant on the Chinese reporting. The boots on the ground is Chinese anti-doping. By 2024, this emerges. So in these 6 months, USADA has said it's contamination. WADA have looked into this and said, we can't disprove that. And so the case is effectively settled. And those 23 swimmers go to Tokyo and they do quite well. Jump ahead. Once it's eventually publicly released because of reporting by New York Times and ARD, then it all kicks off. Because USADA are saying, hang on a moment, procedure wasn't followed. First of all, why was there a delay getting the results in? Why was there a delay establishing contamination? You didn't do enough to confirm contamination as a viable explanation. The athletes should have been provisionally suspended until contamination could have been established or ruled out, as the case may be. So USADA levels all these different accusations very strongly, to the point that Tygart words it as a crushing blow, or I forget exactly what his wording was around that. WADA then responds similarly strongly, and that's kind of what kicked off the dispute that we're now still involved in.
And essentially what happens then is WADA get an independent assessor to come in there to see whether WADA could have done more, and then they also exonerate WADA by saying WADA did as much as they could at the time.
Yes.
So there was some argument, some truth to what Tygart was saying, but there was also fairly good defense that WADA had as well.
Yeah, and I think to WADA's credit, their first investigation happens before this is known. This was in March, April 2021. WADA's already looking into this as much as they possibly could. It becomes public knowledge in April 2024. That's when the media releases this. And then WADA commissions this independent review by a Swiss prosecutor, a guy called Eric Cottier, who then goes and reviews how WADA handled the case. And his conclusion, yes, is that WADA are not at fault. They didn't show favoritism. he does raise a number of things that USADA didn't do. I listed some of them earlier: the delay in the reporting, the delay in confirming contamination, the ease with which they accepted a contamination defense, and so on. So it was. I think both sides have got a claim to make. From WADA's perspective, they would have had a dilemma, because you can appeal the USADA ruling, basically, that it was contamination and the athletes are not at fault. But then when you appeal it, you've got to go with evidence. And what do they have? They didn't have enough to follow through with an appeal. So I think...
And they even say that, having consulted legal counsel, that's why they didn't then pursue that further in a legal sense.
Right. So I can understand why they didn't go further with it. But I also understand why Travis is unhappy that they didn't. Because even if you do it just for the... I'm going to say for the sake of doing it, but because of the message that it sends to do it, I think it might have been important to do. But I'll read to you, this is what Witold Banker, who's the president of WADA, said. At every stage, WADA followed all due process and diligently investigated every lead in line in this inquiry in this matter. If we had to do it over again, we would do exactly the same thing. Now, I don't know that that's entirely true, because they didn't go to China. They couldn't. So to be precise, they did everything they could, given the constraints of the world at that moment. But they're pretty confident. We carefully reviewed the decision. We interrogated every piece of evidence. This is Banker again. We collected new information. No credible evidence of wrongdoing was provided by any source who came forward. So the threshold to open an investigation was not met. And it's kind of like a case of, it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. And I think WADA said, we can't prove that it was doping. 23 swimmers, that looks like it could be systematic doping, but it could also be that someone spilled their TMZ into the soup and then 23 athletes ingested it. So very messy. And it's continued to be messy. We're now 4 years down the line from when it all happened, almost 5, and it's still a mess.
And you'll hear a number of occasions that Travis actually refers to this case in the interview that you're going to continue listening to now, because it's obviously very top of mind for him.
So our athletes over the years have come to us and said, look, Travis, we're happy you're showing up at, 6 o'clock in the morning and you're following us to school. You're interrupting, when we're taking our wife to the hospital because she's about to give birth to our kid. Like, these are true examples. My son's birthday party, you interrupted, so I have to give a sample. We're okay. We don't like it necessarily, but we're willing to do it. But it can't be we do that and then we show up in Paris and get robbed by the system that is not going to handle 23 positive tests in the way that the rules require them to be handled. That can't happen. And so what are you doing about it? As an athlete in the U.S., it's not their job. We shouldn't expect them to put on their shoulders to go fix that system. They need to trust the leaders that understand the system, that play and participate in the system to actually effectuate some change. So ultimately, it's better for them.
So, I mean, we know in 2020 there was the Rodchenkov Act, which kind of gave USADA a little bit more power in terms of chasing the international scene. Just kind of explain how that works and how USADA sees that act working for them. Does it allow you then to go in other countries, and who actually passes that act?
Yeah, no, listen, it's an exceptional act in a lot of ways because it's aimed at stopping fraud and doping fraud specifically, wherever it may happen, if it affects U.S. money and U.S. athletes. And so there has to be U.S. money invested in the event through sponsorship or television broadcast. And from a policy standpoint, you can understand the U.S. government wanting to ensure its investment, like NBC's billions of dollars. We don't want to invest billions of dollars into the Sochi Olympics that become a fraudulent event. And so it has to have U.S. money, has to have U.S. athletes, one or more, and foreign athletes competing in it. And then the WADA code has to apply. So it's absolutely consistent with the WADA code. It exempts athletes from being prosecuted, but it holds those in the system, athlete support personnel, people outside of the system. The first 3 indictments that have come down and some jail time already has been put in place. It's people that have nothing to do with sport. They're just doctors who are giving these drugs to athletes. And we've had one very successful case in partnership, a Nigerian athlete and several other athletes associated with it in partnership with the AIU that ultimately resulted in criminal charges. So I think it was a great example, hopefully, of the power of that law when it's implemented in the right ways. Hopefully, the passage of that law itself has also sent a really good deterrent message to people that have seen it, how easy in the past it has been to dope athletes, take a percentage of their winnings and get away with it, because there's really no other laws like this that would apply in that scenario. And I'll say this last thing. I mean, some of the world at WADA was against it. They lobbied against it, actually, if you can believe that. But what ultimately got it over the finish line and passed by Congress and unopposed, and then signed into law by President Trump under his first administration in late 2020, was because in 2019, the world went through the WADA revision process. And what became a glaring hole in the WADA code was that sport officials, particularly from Russia at the time, but also government officials, were exempt. They weren't covered by the WADA code. So they could dope athletes, they could commit violations under the code, but the code didn't apply. And Craig Reedy, the president of WADA at the time, told everyone, well, we're changing the code to cover these sport officials. So someone like a Vitaly Mutko, right, from Russia, I don't know if you know the name, but he was the sports minister of Russia at the time. He oversaw and orchestrated the large-scale state-sponsored doping program that the Russians ran for many, many years. And yet he escaped any consequence. In fact, he got a promotion within Russia, and then he became the head of the FIFA 2018 World Cup after he just defrauded sport in such a horrific way and ruined the lives, frankly, of many athletes who got robbed by Russian athletes who really never can be made whole. In fact, we're just now about to give a medal back to a U.S. athlete that lost in 2012. Can you imagine London Games in 2012, where she hasn't gotten the medal yet? Technically, it's been decided she's going to get the medal, and that's awesome and great. But come on, it's 13 years later. And so the guy that oversaw that and caused that to happen, no consequence. So WADA said, we're changing those rules. And in fact, in the first draft of the revised code, they had a wonderful provision. We actually helped write the provision, a wonderful provision. And then on the eve of the code being adopted in 2019 in Katowice, Poland, in a closed-door meeting, WADA removed that provision from the WADA code. And it was really that act that we then went to Congress and said, look, guys, if they would have done that, maybe we don't need this law. But given that they pulled that out and are okay with the Vitaly Mutkos of the world and the Thomas Ions of the world and Bessibers of the world, who oversaw sport that robbed athletes and they knowingly participated and allowed dirty athletes to rob other athletes, they don't get any consequence from sport. We can't possibly live in that environment anymore. And look, Congress and ultimately President Trump and first administration agreed, and it was a smart law. And it's been used, I think, very effectively since its passage.
Why though, did they take it out? Is there any possible, even if you were playing kind of devil's advocate to your own position, is there a reasonable argument to say that WADA shouldn't have a law like that in its books? You alluded in your answer there to it's a very powerful law. Could one make the case that a powerful tool like that is open to abuse, and it's better that WADA doesn't have something, but okay for independent NADAs to have it? Is there any reasonable justification that I might be missing for why it wouldn't be there?
Yeah, and remember, this would be a rule of sport that WADA would put in the code, not some sort of law through the WADA code. It would just be a rule of sport that, look, if you oversee as a government official, as a sport official, as a doctor, as a coach, if you oversee and conspire to dope athletes and that happens, you're kicked out of sport. But that's the rule they took out. So now, if you're a government official, if you're a board member of the IOC, if you're the head of International Weightlifting Federation, there's no sport rules that cover you. You're untouchable when it comes time to those types of the WADA code applying to you. Now, I think what they might say is, well, the government's decided, the sport people decided they didn't want to be covered by the WADA code, and that's why it's not in there. Well, it's like, all right, well, at some point, are we really allowing them to decide what rules they're subject to? And these are good rules, and we should, cause them to be subject to them. And they added a provision about each sport can create its own rules if it wants to try to cover these people in whatever way that they do. So, what we did, while it's not mandatory, our board and all of our staff have, agreed to be bound by the mandatory provisions of the WADA code. And so, we've unilaterally done that. But the other really important point, and it was the point I made, this law also expands the jurisdiction to those who dope athletes. So WADA never could. Let's take Lira, who was the first indictment and pled guilty and did some time. Eric Lira, he was given hardcore drugs, human growth hormone, testosterone, clomiphene, to a number of athletes and coaching them and training them how to defeat testing, hide from testers, show up and win. And his athlete, Blessing, Nigerian sprinter, she was doped to the gills and was going to show up in Tokyo 2021, ran the preliminary rounds, and she was aiming to win the 100 or 200 meter final. And she was doped and she was ready to do it. So he's outside of sport. No sport organization had any jurisdiction over him. He's not credentialed. He's not a member. He just sits out there in Never Never Land. Well, this law covers him now because it's a federal law that applies because he violated it. And then he can be held accountable. Again, the idea is not anyone to be held accountable because no one violates and dopes athletes, right? The deterrent piece, I think, is really, really important by it. But it expands the ability of basically, government and law enforcement to cover those who are going to dope, by definition of the WADA code, dope athletes and conspire to dope athletes that then defrauds events where the rules apply. So we think that's a very good thing, in addition to covering those who are directly involved with sport that aren't covered by the WADA code.
But again, I just want to come back to it is I can understand actually, I think there is an argument to be made that if WADA didn't have it and the US has this law, this tool, there would be a perception that now the US has got a tool no one else has got and it's open to some abuses and so on. I get that. But the solution isn't that no one should have it. It should be that everyone should have it.
I 1,000% agree. And we had
why have
really
other
good
countries? Yeah.
100%. 100%. Everyone should have it. And one of the points that WADA lobbied against was, well, this is going to separate. And our response was, well, no, everyone should have the same law. How powerful would that be if Canada, and we had conversations with the Canadian folks, the Norwegians, we had conversations with, there was a draft. I don't know if it was ever introduced, but there was a draft bill there. The Germans, and remember, some countries have their own more domestic focused criminal law, like in Italy and France and Germany. So it's not all that dissimilar to their laws and what they can prosecute. The difference is it follows the U.S. money. So if the U.S. money is going outside of just the U.S. to international events, which a lot of it does, right? I mean, NBC, and you look at the sponsors of the IOC, 70% roughly is U.S. companies, and it's their money that, we're trusting the system to uphold and support and make sure they get what they invest in. And when they get 2012 Olympic Games or 2014 Olympic Games or 2016 Olympic Games where the Russians have poisoned them and tainted them, they're not getting what they pay for. And so the U.S. government saw all this and said, we're gonna actually help. So maybe those countries don't have enough investment by their companies or their countries into the games to worry about it from a fraud standpoint as much as we do. But to your point, I think we should get every country in the world to pass the exact same law. And if WADA, was willing to look more broadly and actually want to stop doping. I mean, I literally had a person high up in the U.S. sport community tell me after coming back from an international meeting, I was like, help me understand why, the sport people are against the Rodchenkov Act. And it basically came down to like, look, anytime people get caught doping, that's a bad day for sport, right? And I'm like, well, you're telling me that, are you telling me they don't really want to catch people the right way? Like this can't, that's the one thing that has always separated us from the sports side of the effort is that it can't be a charade. We can't just pretend to have clean sport. We actually have to deliver clean sport, or the whole thing is just a fraud. It's artificial. It's a fraud, and we shouldn't the hypocrisy of claiming it ought to be clean when we know that there are athletes out there, and we know the system is not fit for fit for the best outcomes. And sometimes the best outcomes, I mean, you're seeing it with the Kenya situation. Sometimes the best outcomes, unfortunately, are exposing the bad side of it.
Right. So the Rodchenkov Act established first proposed in 2016?
Yeah, I think 2016 was the date.
I mean, basically the idea was that they could then criminally prosecute people involved in the system of doping, and not just those athletes that were caught doping. And it obviously means that the American authorities have far more reaching powers than other agencies around the world.
But very importantly, across their borders. Because there are some countries where doping is criminalized, specifically trafficking. Like there are very few places where the doper will go to jail for using EPO to win a medal in a cross-country race. But there are quite a few countries where doping is criminalized. So for instance, Italy, France, Germany, the administration, trafficking and distribution of banned substances can be a criminal offense. So the Rodchenkov Act is not unique in that respect, but what did make it unique is that it allowed the US to go beyond its own borders. And Travis mentioned there that it had to involve US money, and he even gave the NBC example. So NBC are giving like millions to billions even to the Olympic Committee. That's an investment of US money, which then, when doping happens at the Olympic Games, to cost US athletes, the Rodchenkov Act allows prosecution.
Yeah.
There are other examples. He's talking later, you'll hear it, but he mentioned a guy called Lira. That specific person is Eric Lira, who was a Texas-based naturopath kinesiologist, he called himself, but he was responsible for giving athletes doping substances. So they got him via this, even though the athlete in question was not a US athlete. So what is biggest concern was the overreach issue. Less the criminalization than the overreach, because it effectively allowed the US to have this global prosecutor role. And there was some concern at the time, and there are quotes from WADA specifically on this, about how it would break the harmonization of anti-doping. Because anti-doping is meant to be, if you're a doper in Chile versus Korea versus South Africa versus Australia versus Norway, you should have the same legal systems governing that doping. On the other side, how many times have we, even on this podcast, expressed frustration when an athlete gets done for doping and the athlete didn't do it themselves? This is an athlete who has embarked on a very sophisticated plan to use undetectable drugs, or to use drugs at times they can't be detected, masking agent, and you look at this and you go, there's no way that the athlete did that themselves. And how frustrating is it that you can't get the entourage or the network, the supplier?
And that's really what he's on about, isn't it?
Exactly.
He knows that those are the people you actually need to be able to get.
Right. It's a massive hole in the anti-doping system. It's one of the biggest frustrations, is that the people who are actually doing it never get caught, and the people who get caught are the ones who don't have any. They're not free of fault. They're athletes who are doping. They're at fault. But if you're going to bring the system down, you can't focus on the user.
Because there is some suggestion that it's potentially the coaches, the agents, particularly in the American system, when they're bringing these Kenyan athletes, and obviously somebody's benefiting and profiting from the performances of these athletes. And as we know, a lot of those athletes don't have the means to be able to dope, really well and understand the process. But
right. So that's the point, is these people might, and they're not always outside the system. Eric Lira was. Some of the agents and doctors might be inside the system because they're employed in the sport. Vitaly Mutko, the Russian minister of sport, outside the system. I think you could make the case he should be treated as if inside. But it's the overreach and the fact that they could now reach across borders, and there's criminal jurisdiction outside of the US's national borders. And that's what WADA was saying, is now you're going to create overlapping laws. They were nervous, for instance, I suppose they still are, that if you have criminal laws then why would someone come forward as a whistleblower? Why would you invite that on yourself? So there was this concern that it would shut down the investigative capacity in other countries, because now the US will dig into you when you become a whistleblower. There were some criticisms we alluded to earlier on. WADA said, well, hang on a moment, if you're going to use this around the rest of the world, then why don't you do it in your own borders, in the NFL, the NBA, the NHL? So I said, if it's not good enough for American sports, why do you want to impose this act on the world? I still maintain what I asked him there is, I think the solution is that the world should have some mechanism that can allow them to do this. But the tool, I think the asymmetry and the potential for abuse of power was the main concern. The asymmetry in the sense that US has it, no one else has got it. You could fix that by giving everyone else the same thing.
Yeah.
But not in a way that makes it free for all.
The same thing, it means that every country would then have to adopt a law, a legal law, which again, the process of that is not just a case of saying, well, let's just have a law.
Yeah.
There's a whole parliamentary process that's going to have to happen.
Yeah, and so you can understand from WADA's perspective, this is complicated. And from those national anti-doping agencies, it's complicated. Because even if they adopted a law, to have the same as the US, they've got to have a law that allows them to go. So now you're going to tell Norway that it can pop across to Sweden and get So you can see they may have been reluctant. And that meeting you spoke about where they drafted a statement and then was taken out would be fascinating to really know. That's why I asked, like, why did they take it out? Like, what were the... But you can understand this is not so simple as give us a lever, give us a tool that we can go and do it. Because even though in principle, I think it would be great to have that, you can see how there's nerves and anxiety around it. I don't know that it's just because we don't want to catch dopers. I do agree, though. I've written an article before saying where there's a will, there's a way. And I think there are ways. And when they're not being used, you've got to question the will. But I think in this instance, it's a little bit more complicated than maybe it sounds.
Welcome back. You are listening to the Science of Sport podcast.
The cynic in me says, when people say, oh, there's a country, Kenya, there's a sport, whichever, cycling, has a doping problem, part of the answer is, well, that's because they have a testing problem from the perspective of the athletes. I reckon many sports have a doping problem they're unaware of or don't want you to be aware of. And I do think in the last decade or so, I worry that there's an apathy that sports and anti-doping authorities have almost become facilitators and are happy to catch one or two, usually small names, to create the illusion that something's going on, but there's not really a drive to solve it at the extent that it's happening.
I think that's absolutely right. And listen, I think I've pulled a clip of a video from, I think it was in 2012 or 2013 that Dick Pound did after he led this group, Ineffectiveness of Testing. And you could watch it, but he basically says the infrastructure is there, but it's the will and the determination of actually using that infrastructure to root out doping. And I couldn't agree more. And I think, we've seen it with this China situation. There's a lot of apathy, a lot of people, good people, but appreciate the demands of the system and the complexities of it. And then when they stand up, to bullies, or wrongdoing in the system, they attempt to crush them, right? Bullies do what bullies do. And then it forces good people to leave the industry. And there's been a lot of good people that have left over the last, few years. It is frustrating to feel like you continue to bang your head up against the wall and don't get to achieve the level that you could for athletes around the globe. But if we're going to do this job, we have to be real about it. I think I'm not a cynic, but like you, Ross, and it's why I love what you do. We should be skeptical and we should be honest about the failures. And I don't see it as being, necessarily a skeptic, although I think there's a valuable spot for that. I see it as the Olympic mindset. If you want to be a champion, a gold medalist, you have to look at your performance. And you have to be honest about your performance. You got to look at your nutrition, your exercise, how you're training, your recovery. We call it in the US, you watch the film. You go back and you look at your performance and you critique every element of it to be the best, to get that, 0.5%, difference to be the winner. And we're not inspired by the global leadership and anti-doping to do that. In fact, the opposite has happened. We're suffocated. They've tied our hands with, I think the number off the top of my head, 2,700 pages of the WADA code program. You know how many documents we're at the tail end actually of, I don't know, I guess an 18-month period of reviewing the WADA code program. So all the rules, the standards, the technical letters, the code itself. You know how many documents WADA has sent out asking the community to read and provide feedback on? Can I ask the question? What's your best guess?
Does this include documents like the technical documents that tell you how to handle the sample?
All of it. All of it. That they're asking stakeholders, around the world and athletes to provide substantive feedback on. I don't know if I get to interview you here. That would be more fun, actually. Over 7,600 pages of documents.
Jeez, okay. It's a lot to get through.
You sit back from this and say, what in the world? And then you do all that and you put the time and effort into it. And then you see what happens with China, where the rules are crystal clear that China should have brought those cases forward, should have notified the athletes, should have done B samples, should have charged the athletes, should have put in mandatory provisional suspensions, should have given them a hearing, should have announced them whatever the outcome was. And then WADA gets the file and does nothing with it. That's what's so incredibly frustrating.
Is what happened in China
for those
unique?
of us who care about it.
Is the Chinese situation unique, or is it just the one we know about? Because if I remember correctly, someone from USADA told WADA that they'd had the cases. They could have just sat on it entirely, and no one would be any the wiser, right? Do you think it happens more?
No. I mean, in a way, China sent it to them. I mean, they covered themselves, but they obviously. What's crazy is through the course of all that, additional cases in China that should have gone forward in swimming with hardcore positive steroid tests, according to the media reports, those got exposed. So it's not a one-off with China, but I can assure you, in the U.S. and in Europe, any case that there would be no chance in the U.S. that would have happened. And AIU, in a recent conference that I attended, Play the Game, AIU's head said no chance in athletics that would have happened. They would have appealed those cases, 100%.
So the AIU is the Athletics Integrity Unit, and Ross, their job is basically to be the testing people for athletics.
Yeah, so they were established by World Athletics, and testing is part of their mandate. It's all integrity issues. And there's a few sports like it. Tennis has got something called the ITIA. The AIU is the athletics equivalent. So what Travis Tygart is saying there is, if those 23 cases arose in the US athletes, or if those 23 cases were in track and field athletes, remember the authority, in this case AIU, could say, we don't accept the Chinese explanation that it was contamination in a hotel kitchen, and we're going to appeal that. So it's critical again of WADA for not appealing it, for accepting the Chinese without doing, in his view, enough investigation, and also for not provisionally suspending those athletes, because in theory they should say you're suspended until we can get to the bottom of this, and they just feel it was handled very loosely.
Yeah.
So we don't know. It's why we're calling for an independent audit of WADA, because we ought to get to the bottom of how many of these cases are there. The other one that raises this issue is in the Sinner case. If you follow that, the Onyx Sinner, tennis player, at the tail end of it, or on the eve of the hearing that WADA was appealing, they ended up cutting a deal with him for 3 months. And we can get in the weeds on that case if you want to, and the substantive elements of it. But when WADA cut the deal, they justified it on a specific provision in the WADA code, what's known as the case resolution. And in announcing the center and defending themselves, or attempting to, they said we've had 67 other cases that we've used this provision. The provision's only been in the WADA code since 2021, so it's relatively new. But they said they had 67 cases. Well, we went and looked in the WADA documents to its executive committee and foundation board and in the press, and we could only find 12 cases announced. And so, and informed, announced publicly or informed to its governing boards. And so here we go again, where they've acknowledged basically that they're sitting on roughly 50 cases that no one knows what the outcomes were. And that gives them the power. They justify, I think, there's a debate whether they have this power, that they don't have to apply the rules in certain cases, that they enter a case resolution agreement.
Yeah, so the Annex Sinner case is fairly controversial in that they did come to an agreement with him. So when did these agreements, why do they come about? I mean, how do they come to an agreement over a doping offense?
Well, his was the first I can remember it happening at. Travis said 12, right? So he's one of 12, but there were like 50, mid-50s that we didn't know about. So for every one we know of, there are 5 we don't. So difficult question to answer. But basically, remember what happened there was Sinner failed 2 tests for a banned substance. Mm-hmm. He didn't serve a provisional suspension because he was very quickly able to argue that it was a likely contamination. And there's a specific provision in anti-doping rules that allows the provisional suspension to be set aside. So that looked like favoritism, point number 1, even though there was a provision in the rules. And then when he had his hearing with the aforementioned Tennis Integrity Agency, he was cleared of wrongdoing. Most listeners will know that story. Physio, contamination on his massage when he was giving him a rub downs. WADA did appeal that. So they were imminently headed to the Court of Arbitration to hear the facts again of that case so that an arbitration panel could make a ruling on whether Sinner should serve some time or not. But before they got to the case, the parties presumably sat down and said, look, here's the situation. And this is like any law and order show you watch where the authorities and the perpetrator reach an agreement because it's in everyone's best interest to do so as opposed to going to trial. And I would imagine the conversation went something like, if Sinner goes to CAS and he loses, he could get a month, he could get a year, maybe 2 years. That's a big penalty. But if WADA goes, the risk is that Sinner gets off entirely too. So anything was on the table there from 0 all the way to 24 months. And I think they probably said, look, Yannick, you got to do something here because we can't say there's no fault. But he's saying, but I didn't have fault. So they say, well, what if we compromise slightly and give you 3 months? Because that way you don't miss a Grand Slam. You'll be back in time for one tournament before the French Open. And he says, I'm happy to do that. I'm not going to accept that I was guilty of anything, but I'll take my medicine, as it were. Okay. Pardon the pun. And so they kind of like it's in effect finding a compromise that allows them not to go to arbitration and not to risk losing.
Because neither side is guaranteed of winning whatever case might happen.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, you want to take your chances in court, pal? I'll see you in court. But they don't want to neither side wants to take their chances. So they're sort of managing their risk. For WADA, the risk is he gets off entirely and they look like they've lost face. For him, the risk is he gets 1 or 2 years. But both parties are happy at 3 months. And so they say, maybe they said, what about 6? He said, no, then I'm going to miss French and Wimbledon, not signing that. They say, okay, 3. And so that's what's happened there. Now, the thing is, we know that one.
Yeah.
And I think that the point that Tygart is making, and this is a really important one, it's going to come up again, is how many times are these things agreed without anyone's knowledge? And should they be agreed without knowledge? That's in theory,
they shouldn't be, because if they've been agreed, then they're not making them public, which means because there's been a deal struck and therefore why should we know about it?
Yeah, but then you're asking people to trust the system, and there's inherently this mistrust of the system.
So
and
the idea is there's lack of transparency here.
I think that's fundamentally what it boils down to. And I think Travis is right, is that if you're not transparent and you've got all these cases where doping offenses may have occurred because you've got a sample that's positive, urine or blood, whatever it is, even if that's the result of innocent source contamination or ingestion, whatever, I think it still helps the system for those to be known, because that's a deterrent in future, because now there's public scrutiny, there's potential accountability. You may not necessarily be a doper at fault or guilty of doping, but I think it still helps the system to have those things known. I suppose WADA would argue that if we know that it's a contamination and we know you weren't guilty of doping, then why should we reveal you to the public so that you now have this label over your head?
Which is fair.
Which is also fair. But I think for the greater good of the system, I think it's better that those things are known.
Or at least they're given to the federations that, no, as you said, even the federations didn't know about some of these supposed agreements. Whereas the federations would know and have a record of it. Maybe it might not be public, but it'll be within the federation books.
And we don't, you see, again, we don't know you asked me, what are the circumstances under which this agreement can be reached? No idea.
Yeah.
No idea.
Many and varied.
Yes, but although, again, I think the provision in the code will say where there's compelling evidence of no fault and so on. But the problem is it just opens up the possibility that some people can get preferential treatment that no one will ever know exists. And if that's the case, then how do we trust what is inherently mistrusted? That's the problem.
So you got this system that is just, and we see, and to be really clear, in the Chinese cases, there was no case management agreement. Like they would be in a much better position if they would have done that, and they could then say, well, we did it under this rule. All right, we're less probably screaming and yelling. But they didn't do that. And they just allowed China to sweep it under the carpet and no announcement. I mean, we could go through all the different violations. But on top of just the case itself, WADA also has the power under the code to direct organizations to take results management action. And they didn't direct China to take any action. They could have actually also taken the cases out of China's hands and given it to another organization, and China would have had to have paid for that to then follow the rules. And so the Chinese athletes didn't get their rights. Their due process rights were totally violated. And there were athletes in China who lost to the ones that had positive tests at that national event. Their rights were totally violated. The last point, WADA also has compliance powers. And some of the violations, the rules that China failed to follow, such as notification of the athlete, B samples, charging, imposition of mandatory provisional suspensions, those are critical findings, the most egregious under the compliance scheme. And yet WADA didn't do anything from a compliance standpoint on them. So you sit back and when you see it as you see it and you know the rules, you just have to throw your hands up in the air and demand answers like we've been doing. And unfortunately, we've asked to sit down with them repeatedly. We've asked for answers on it repeatedly, and they just refuse to provide any answers and basically remain on the point that they did everything right and they wouldn't do anything different. And it just can't be that way.
I think it's fair to say that one of the biggest threats to anti-doping is this perception that a lot of NADAs are reaching these silent agreements with athletes and they're not disclosing positive tests. They're rather doing what have been called colloquially silent bans. Athlete goes away for 3-6 months. It never comes out. That's what you're talking about here, right, Travis? And
yeah, 100%. And you have to announce. And look, there may be a delay in the timing of an announcement, right? Like we had recently the Marvin Bracey Williams case. We provisionally suspended when the positive first happened in February of roughly 24. We notified WADA, we notified AIU, we notified track and field, we notified USA Track and Field, we notified the USOPC, but we didn't publicly announce it. The athlete could have said whatever they wanted, but he then participated in a law enforcement investigation around the Rodchenkov Act. And so the thought was, look, if you announce it, that just exposes people maybe more skeptical to him if he is talking to them or gathering evidence, whatever the feds ultimately had him do. But the parties that needed to know knew. And then when the investigation concluded, his sanction was announced. So there may be good reason at times to delay that, but that's not what happened in China. That's not what happened in those 50 other cases that were settled. And there's nothing wrong with settling a case. And the rules allow that to happen if you do it within the rules. Yeah. And then you announce it. But it can't be a confidential settlement, right? And I'm afraid, so your listeners that are interested, the new WADA code that's coming into effect only makes that much more likely to happen. No announcements. in certain cases. And we're obviously very concerned about that. So instead of moving towards more openness and transparency that builds confidence in the system, it's closing and giving more control to just a few people at the top of WADA to make the decisions they want without any accountability.
I've heard it said, and I don't know if you can agree or not with this, there are some athletes that are on a protected list and they cannot announce a positive. I think that's true for sports, of many sports. I could make a list of 10 athletes across half a dozen sports, and I reckon there'd be so much reticence to even disclose doping that this quiet, silent settlement option is probably being used more than people realize. If that's true, then anti-doping is in major, major trouble.
I 1,000% agree. I mean, listen, that would never happen in our world. And and some people say, USADA does all that too. But look, I say go ask Lance Armstrong or Justin Gatlin or Tyler Hamilton, or like you're the elite of the elite, and the truth is being revealed. So the proof's sort of in the pudding, right? But look, it can't be that way. The system is not set up that way. Uh-oh, did I lose you guys?
Yep, still here.
No, still here.
Okay. Oh, sorry. It can't be that way, right?
Can we just take just a change in tack quickly, because we're interested? I know we've got running a bit short of time, but one of the interesting parts, I remember reading a story on The Guardian where one of your former investigators, Victor Burgos, was interviewed by one of the journalists talking about how he went about these investigations. I'm very interested to kind of explain how the semantics of this works. In other words, do you chase leads? Do you just rely on testing to find positive athletes and then chase a lead from that? Or is it like an active sort of FBI-like investigation once you suspect certain athletes that may or may not be taking, or groups that are taking, et cetera, et cetera? How does it all work in terms of how you investigate potential doping?
Yeah, I listen, all of it, right? Like, I mean, we obviously are bound by, law. So we have to follow the law. For example, we can't, break down someone's house and search their place or something like that. But anything up to where the law is very clear, we will do. I mean, it's talking with people, it's showing up at events, it's regularly talking to athletes. I mean, the Rodchenkov Act case with the Blessing Nigerian athlete outcome, it was if you want to call it a source, I call it a supporter, a friend even, who I've known for 10 years, picked up the phone and called me and said, hey, blah, 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 and was like, all right, I'm then on the phone with Vic and AIU and the feds. And, so that came to us unbeknownst to us, but we're also looking at, biological testing information and executing tests. We have a tip line, real response, and you can anonymously send in information. I think rough numbers, we get 300 or so of those tips, let's call it. And, about maybe 70 of those we will execute that, or something that we can actually deal with, meaning we have jurisdiction.
When you say 300, do you mean 300 what, per month, per year?
Per year. Oh, sorry. Yeah, great question. Right. On an annual basis, roughly 300. And we'll execute, where if we have, sometimes we'll get a call on, some athlete, we have no jurisdiction, not in our sport or in our country or whatever. We'll liaise, of course, if there's jurisdiction, whether it's college or pro or others. But assuming that we have jurisdiction, then about 70 of those or so we will test off of. And then we have about a 10% results in a case and a finding, an ADRV, off of those as well. And so without question, the statistics of our, whether testing or investigations to bring a case based off of the information we get through our tip process is by far higher than our out of competition or our regular domestic testing program, which is still running about consistent with those around the world, about half of 1% positive. However, the success or the evaluation of a testing program is not just on the positivity number, right? There is a deterrent, and it's tough to estimate or get an exact number on what that deterrent value looks like. So we would never throw away the testing altogether, but we for sure think a shift away from the testing into what we call the investigative, the I&I, the non-analytical. And what's also really fascinating is on the testing side, we'll have, let's just ballpark 30% of our positive tests end up being what I call innocent source positive. So meat contamination or water or kissing or intimacy or using your roommate's arm sleeve, whatever, not intentional cheats. But on the non-analytical, the investigative side, I think 100% of those are intentional cheats, because you don't go beyond innocent stuff because you don't know, it's only through testing you're going to reveal that. And so on balance, we think the world should be moving towards the non-analytical. And look, we've known that going back to Balco days in 2003 and 2004. And look, I think this is an area we've talked with the WADA folks about as well. There are no real measurements on the I&I side. And we know many organizations don't even have I&I departments or the expertise, whether it's sport level at the IF level. Hopefully more of those are getting it through the ITA that is consolidated, but not all of them are hiring the ITA to do investigative work. And those sports who are still maintaining their own programs, not going to the ITA or AIU, something like that, not all of those have I&I. And we know the NATOs, even some of the more advanced NATOs, don't have I&I capabilities. So that's an area that there's still a lot of
One of the interesting parts of that interview that I read is that there was a case of actually coaching somebody inside who'd been tested positive, and then there was an agreement reached with the athlete that they would go back into that space. They would continue to train and race, and they would give information to USADA.
100%.
How often is that used?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't happen at all anymore, because new WADA leadership doesn't want that happening, right? And won't even entertain it, unfortunately. And if you've followed it closely, they've used that example and another example politically against us to say, try to say we did something wrong or whatever outside of the rules. But what's crystal clear is the rules allowed for it at the time. You had to get WADA's involvement and notice on it, which we did. It was WADA's chief investigative officer that introduced us to the person that would, introduce us to the right law enforcement people, given the information we had gotten from this athlete. And so the rules allowed for it. What's also really interesting, I mentioned revisions to the WADA code. They're now changing the WADA code, that provision that allows it. They're doing away with it. So now you can't do what we did. And look, there's policy debates around it. We like the authority to do it if the right set of facts allows you to do it and justify doing it for something bigger. In that particular case, we had I think it was a Kenyan athlete who was brought in, and the evidence they provided to us was that we felt like this human trafficking, not only doping of athletes, but borderline human trafficking. It was mid-level races. They were bringing Kenyan athletes over, taking their passports, putting them in an apartment. They were paying for all their bills and meals, very minimal, but more than what the Kenyan athletes were receiving back at home, as you can appreciate. And then the agents were getting all the money that the athletes were winning at some of these, in the U.S., there's on any given weekend, dozens of, 10Ks and 15Ks and half marathons and marathons. They're not the elite pro like New York or Chicago, LA, Boston, but they will pay, $10,000 or $15,000 if you win or place. And so they were, allowing these athletes to dope. These athletes aren't high enough in the registered testing pool or on our radar or AIUs to be in a regular testing program. And they'll send them to these races to win money. The agents would keep all the money and then just farm out a little bit of money to the athletes who they were maintaining. So it was a horrific scheme. And so we felt like it was justified in that case, and we got WADA's approval, and WADA fully agreed that it was justifiable. And it led to a lot of actually great outcomes on the criminal investigation side. The person worked with the DEA, and maybe the FBI as well. But that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, from our perspective, current WADA leadership has removed the ability to do that.
So this has been one of the most contentious issues between WADA and USADA, and the fact that USADA used these moles to get into this network of doping people, and then if you have the mole in there, you can get more information, etc., etc. But as he says, WADA have essentially stopped them from doing that. But this is something that happened a couple of times where there was this one. He actually said USADA for a while said they had approval from WADA. WADA said they never gave approval, and there was this back and forth. There was a story by Reuters that went up that became a big controversial story. That story was eventually taken down, but the fact that USADA had done something wrong, and USADA then claimed sort of a partial victory over this very issue. But it is another one of those burning controversies that is stuck with those two bodies.
Yeah, so in the timeline of the war, the civil war, remember the Chinese 23 story was like early 2024. This was later 2024, which is in the second half. On the 7th of August 2024, Reuters ran a piece whose title was "Athletes Undercover, Global and US Anti-Doping Agencies Clash Over Tactics." The tactic being, you've caught a doper, but instead of sanctioning that doper, naming them and sanctioning them, you're going to send them back into the field to be undercover moles or operatives, as you've said. Now, that was revealed, and WADA were really quick to pounce on it, because in one sense, it was kind of like what they'd been criticized by USADA for allowing China to do, obviously without the undercover operative, but not naming them and letting them to continue to compete. And there's actually, I think it's quite an interesting ethical question is, do you get more benefit from letting a doper go and continue to compete, or should you actually just treat everyone the same and saying, in other words, when is the greater good greater than the good of banning a doper? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And what I think Travis is arguing there is that they feel that in this particular instance, they got a lot out of it because they were effectively exposing what they call trafficking, not drugs, humans. Human trafficking out of Kenya. WADA, for their part, on the same date, issued a statement, and I wanted to read parts of that for you. USADA's scheme threatened the integrity of sporting competition, which the code seeks to protect. By operating it, USADA was in clear breach of the rules. Contrary to the claims made by USADA, WADA did not sign off on this practice of permitting drug cheats to compete for years on the promise that they would try to obtain incriminating evidence against others. Now, there is a provision in anti-doping, and there was at the time, that if you provided, and I quote, significant assistance, that you would get a reduced sentence. So they did allow that to happen, but this obviously went further in WADA's views than that. And they talk about one case of an elite athlete who competed in international events in the USA, who took steroids and EPO and was permitted to continue competing all the way to retirement. Case was never published, results never disqualified, prize money never returned, and no suspensions ever served. In that case, when USADA eventually admitted to WADA that what had been going on, it advised that any publication of consequences or disqualification would put the athlete's security and safety at risk, and asked WADA to agree to non-publication. Being put in this impossible position, WADA had no choice but to agree. So that was also part of the WADA statement. So you can see how this thing unraveled. And whilst there may have been some agreement that you can ask athletes to provide substantial assistance, it feels as though there was either a major breakdown in communications, or it wasn't or there was a misunderstanding in exactly what was going to be done with these doping athletes. And that's the context for why WADA's now basically censured them and said you cannot do that anymore.
One thing that USADA said is when they had these moles in the space, they weren't, one of the provisions of them having this is that they weren't allowed to dope again. And obviously they tested them fairly regularly. But, I think even WADA weren't prepared to even accept that because they were essentially tainted, doped athletes, and they were competing, taking their money away and potentially titles away from people who were legitimate.
Yeah, and it's quite an interesting ethical one. It's like, again, in my watching criminal series on television, if you send an undercover cop in, you know that he's going to have to break some laws. At what point do you say, actually, no, we actually need to stop this now? It's kind of the same concept as that in the anti-doping world. But again, I'm of the opinion that there has to be this greater good, because the biggest thing that in anti-doping we're not catching is that supply chain. And I don't know how else you get it, because if you catch someone and ban them straight away, you'll never get substantial assistance from inside.
And it's always begged the question for me, whenever I've looked at the doping issue, you hear so much about athletes being caught and that sort of thing, but it seems so obvious that you have to get down to the roots. It's much like anything, you know, you talk about these criminal cases. People who are looking for drugs on the street are not looking for the guys on the street doing the drug. They're looking for the suppliers. And that's how you break down the network. And in sport, as we've heard now, they can't do that.
Yeah, exactly.
So they're literally catching the end of the tail, but they're not dealing with the whole body here.
Yeah, and that's the fundamental shift. And I think it comes back to the Rodchenkov Act. It's the same as this, is if anti-doping authorities can't do that, then we will forever just be catching the last person in a pass the parcel game.
Yeah,
and I want to know where the parcel came from. Now, there's a plot twist here, because it turns out eventually Reuters withdrew that story.
Yep.
And there's a statement that then USADA published. This happened later in that year, in September, October. And I want to read to you Tygart's own words. We are thankful Reuters has withdrawn its story, namely the one about the undercover dopers, regarding USADA's use of informants after investigating the sourcing of its information. And what happened here was that it eventually emerged that someone fairly high up in WADA got a pass to go and watch the Masters golf tournament, thanks to Reuters contacts. And so there was an ethical sourcing issue around the article. What I think is important is that Reuters never withdrew the facts of the story. And WADA still maintained that the facts of the story were correct and they were quoted correctly in the story. But the ethics concern was triggered by a journalist arranged for someone who his name was James Fitzgerald, WADA's media chief, to go to the 2024 Masters Golf Tournament. And so it tarnished the story, and it makes it even more confusing now, because the story's been withdrawn, but not necessarily because of what was in the story, but of how the story was obtained. And so, yeah, fog of war stuff.
Maybe they will say, we don't want an athlete who got advantage by using EPO to compete and, you know, be out there in the community still, you know, competing against other athletes. We say, look, we'll test them. We'll wait. We'll have the athlete agree 3 to 6 months. They can't compete, which is what happened. They can't compete at any elite level, certainly not the Olympic Games or World Championships. But having, you know, on balance, so maybe that's their position, and they just say, look, principally, there's never a scenario where it's justifiable to have an athlete who doped at some point in the immediate past competing against other athletes. And I guess I can understand that, and that's logical, but to me, it misses the bigger picture. And having the authority to do it, I think and the world agreed back in that time period, having the authority to do it, and then collect, you know, in partnership with WADA and the IF, deciding when to do it. You know, it's what happened in Russia. WADA sat on information and knew that several Russian athletes were competing at European championships, and they were okay with it then. And you know what? It ultimately allowed what happened in Russia. So the skeptic might say, well, they don't really want what happened in Russia happening again. That's why they're doing away with it. But so I don't fully know. I know what they say, but I've just never found the justification for doing away with it and being upset about it. Now with the new leadership, when, you know, old leadership who actually was willing to, in our opinion, get to the bottom of cheating as opposed to giving the appearance of getting to the bottom of cheating, was fully in support of it and advocated it to be in the rules, and it was in the rules.
Yeah. Ross, you wanted to add a question there?
Yeah, I wanted to come back to something you said earlier, and I've seen you quoted on it in the media. You call them innocent positives, Travis, and these are cases where athletes have failed a doping test as a consequence of taking a banned substance through contamination. And I think we're in a phase now in the world of anti-doping that when there's a headline that says athlete ABC fails doping test, I always look in the first couple of paragraphs to see what was the contaminant in this instance. Was it a supplement? Was it food? Was it intimate contact? We've seen all these cases in the last few months. What I want to ask you is, your proposed solution has been that we could lower the concentration of a drug before it becomes an anti-doping rule violation. And please add to this if I've quoted that incorrectly, such that if a drug is detected at really, really low levels, which they so often are, then we should lean rather towards contamination and not treat that the same as we do a high concentration that indicates deliberate doping. I wanted to ask practically how you see that working, because you don't know if a low concentration in an athlete's urine is a consequence of taking a low dose or taking a large dose many weeks before. So how do we confirm with high confidence when someone's a contamination and when they're not?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, it doesn't always have to be a contamination, right? So and which is why I call it an innocent source positive. For example, the PET medication, a woman was giving a PET medication prescribed to her dog. Her dog ended up dying. One of the top cyclists, female Czech athlete living in the U.S. So we tested her. She daily 3 times was having to give this medication to her dog. Well, the medication wasn't listed, but it contained a peptide, and her just getting it on her hands caused her to have a very, very low level positive. What we propose, and we did this in our UFC program and our non-Olympic programs, and I think it's worked wonderfully well, is for certain substances. Okay, so we're not talking EPO or human growth hormone that don't lend itself to contamination, but the substances we know through evidence base in our testing programs and others around the world that can lend itself to really low. So some of the meat enhancers for sure. There's a couple that you might have to make difficult decisions on, but you create a decision limit, and so it's still reported. Okay, so it's not as if it's not reported. You still test for it at that low level, but you call it an atypical instead of an adverse analytical, because an adverse analytical technically then automatically means 4-year suspension, and the athlete has to prove the source of the positive. And we think having it reported as an atypical then allows you to do an investigation and test the athlete, every day for 2 weeks, to monitor them, to really determine, is this intentional use or gross negligence or negligence even, or is this actually just a completely innocent situation? And I think, unfortunately, again, I think we've proved roughly 18% of our cases, our positives, are proven innocent source positives. I think we have another about 20% where we all here believe that they're innocent source positives, but the athlete has not, or in conjunction with us, we haven't been able to prove it, because it's almost impossible to remember what medication you were using 6 weeks ago, or what restaurant you ate at 6 or 7 weeks ago after the positive comes back. What supplements? Do you even have any? If you're taking medications that are contaminated, which many now today at those low levels are, you have to finish, like antibiotics. You can't save some. And we live in a world now where we're telling athletes, save your medication, save your supplements. And what's changed is the laboratory's ability to see these very minute traces of these drugs. So while it's arguably consistent, Ross, as you've said, with intentional use at the tail end of it, I think we're all smart enough to know athletes, and particularly in RTP that are regularly tested, that's not what this is. This is something different than that. And we ought to adjust the rules in a fair and smart way to make sure we're not railroading innocent athletes who are testing positive by innocent sources and not cheating. Because again, I think that takes away from the foundation of the confidence that athletes have in the system. And I think we think there's simple solutions to it. And thankfully in 2021, way too late, of course, but WADA did open the door to this concept and have put certain drugs in that category, the meat enhancers, the diuretics. And so we have that mechanism in place now. It's just a matter of what additional substances should we put in there. And look, the skeptic says, well, why wouldn't you? Right? Why wouldn't you do that? Isn't that more fair? Isn't that giving innocent athletes the benefit of presumption of innocence? Knowing what we know from a scientific standpoint and a laboratory detection standpoint. Some may say, look, we don't want to run risk that one doper gets away. I don't think that's the risk. I think there's plenty of other areas where that risk is by far greater. I think this is not happening, and I think we could put in a process that would be just as good as it is today, but we would remove, us, dinging and sanctioning innocent athletes, which 100% is happening. And I don't like
normally,
that.
Normally that saying goes something like, it's better to let 100 guilty people go free than to put one innocent away. Not better to, let's not let one guilty person go. And I sort of am coming around to it, mostly because not so much what happens at the end of the process, but even the process of an athlete having an adverse finding, having to go to court, or whether it's a local or eventually at CAS, and then how the media covers it and how the general public must be completely overwhelmed with the confusion of who to believe under what circumstances. If you could avoid, if the anti-doping system could avoid the confusion that those cases create, that in itself would be a win.
Well, listen, I think that's where, leadership, trust, and the system, it's hard to trust the entities at the top right now based on facts. China being the biggest, appeals of certain countries' cases that, are way more demonstrative of outcomes in other countries that stay, swept under the carpet. So it's the lack of trust at the top. People don't really know what to believe. It is complicated, but I think clear speak and honest speak goes a long way. I think it's, how I think our athletes have come to trust us. At least our surveys say that they do. And they appreciate that there are differences in cases, and cases do come down to facts. And sometimes, the facts are seen different by certain arbitrators. But at the end of the day, having trust in the decision-making and the institutions to do the right thing and demonstrate it not on speak, but on a pattern of behavior and action, even when it's tough to do, continuing to do the right thing, I think is how you, persuade, if you care about persuading, the public. We certainly care about our athletes, and they're wanting to have confidence in the system and that the system has their back, because the moment they believe there are special athletes that are never going to be held accountable, or certain athletes are getting less favorable treatment, that's when they're going to lose hope and just say, you know what, I'm going to join the dopers because the payoff is good enough. If I do, and if I get caught, I get caught, but I'll do everything possible not to get caught. And they're willing to take that risk, I think, at that point when they don't have confidence that the system is there for them.
Yeah. My last question is related to that confidence. I think, at least I hope it's fair to say, that if the world of anti-doping was unified and there wasn't a set of disputes and disagreements around what leadership's doing, the whole will versus way issue and so on, it would overall be stronger for the global athlete community. So what I want to ask you is, what's the first sort of show of compromise and change that you would be looking for from WADA in order to come on, and then we get a situation where the media is not reporting dispute between USADA and WADA? What's the first change they need to make in your view?
Yeah. Listen, I couldn't agree more. And I think if you go back and look at the history, where WADA had the height of its credibility and reputation, it recommended in 2016 to ban the Russians. And we were unified. Us, the world, athletes, NADOs, of course, sport didn't like it and the IOC didn't like it, but WADA took a stand. It was his bravest moment. But I'm afraid at its bravest moment, its biggest client, the IOC, backslapped it and basically sent the message, don't ever do that again. Don't ever put us in a position on the eve of the Olympic Games in 2016 where you're recommending banning a country from our Olympic Games. And I think, unfortunately, and you can go back, and I just recently went back and watched the IOC session in 2016 down in Rio and saw it all play out. And it's an incredible scripted attack on WADA and the system. And overhauling it, and how could WADA put the IOC in the position that it did. I think from that moment forward, unfortunately, and you saw global unity, you saw strength, you saw brave action and decision making by the entire global movement. We're all begging to get back to those days. Unfortunately, WADA is going to have to change. We haven't changed, and many in the community haven't changed. But WADA has to change, and I'm not so sure the leadership or the structure of it in the way that it is now. It is going to change. That said, we have offered to sit down with them multiple times. I sent a letter in June that is diplomatic and kind, asking to sit down. We want to talk about these issues, and they just refuse to sit down with us without any conditions. And look, I think there's a real anti-American sentiment there. They refuse to discuss, reform with our government and have some, audit put in place, review of the China situation and disclosure of the file put in place. And they just simply refuse to do that. I think they've bet we don't want the U.S. at the table, and that's fine. We're going to be better off without the U.S. at the table because we can do what we want to do. They don't buy fully into the values that that we have here in the U.S. Freedom of speech, civil discussion, being a skeptic, and being able to have good discourse and a safe environment on that, asking the right questions. It's command and control, and having. Yeah. I think their bet is, and they've planned a 3-year budget without the U.S. money. I think all indications are their decision is we don't want the U.S. at the table, and we'll be fine without the U.S. at the table. In fact, we don't. Life is easier for us if the U.S. isn't at the table because they just ask questions and hold us accountable. And why would we want to do that if we don't have to? And I think that's a really sad and unfortunate environment.
But then I have to ask, where's the rest of the world in this? Because every time I see the media, it's USADA, it's Travis Tygart, it's WADA, it's whoever it is from WADA. There's like hundreds of these national anti-doping agencies, and many of them will have integrity and principles like you do. Is there an opportunity to create a consortium, a conglomerate of nations to say, actually, you know what, this has to stop? And Norway, Spain, England, UK anti-doping, whoever it is, South Africa, why not? Could bring those parties together and say, let's resolve this, because it's not healthy.
Yeah, we've had multiple conversations and meetings, with all stakeholders. And look, I think privately, many of them, they fully support, agree with us 1,000%. WADA didn't follow the rules. They're scared. There's a lot of fear. Remember, WADA sued me, right, in Lausanne, and sued USADA in Lausanne. They brought an ethics complaint, frivolous one, against the White House Director of Office of National Drug Control Policy. I mean, this is the tactics. It's retaliatory. They have politicized the compliance process, and no, people are in this movement to do the right thing, and they're good people, and they believe in the principles of fair and ethical competition. They're not here to have to fight these political battles within their country, and then you overlay WADA getting cozy with China, and China's influence there. It adds a whole nother level. Unfortunately, people have left the movement. Really good people that used to stand up because they're just, why would we do this? It's not, they've made it personal. They attack, they, try to defame programs. They attack athletes in countries that speak out, and people know that. And so WADA's surrounded themselves with, sheep and turtles who will just go where the command and control tells them to go. And that's how they operate. And look, there will be new leadership at WADA. It may be 2.5 years before we know who that is, but there's always hope. And I would encourage people to stand up for their principles. The worst thing you can do with a bully is not stand up to a bully, because then the bully thinks the bullying actually can work. But unfortunately, this world isn't as simple as some of us would like for it to be.
Are you up for that job? Are you up for that job when it comes available? No chance.
Look, they need a very diplomatic person who is willing to roll up their sleeves and do the hard work, but have the relationships internationally to carry it off, but not lose sight first and foremost of the principle of what the role is. And it's not some global politician traveling around kissing babies around the world, staying in fancy hotels and flying first class. It's doing right by clean athletes. And sometimes that takes, the backbone to do what's right, even if it's tough, like holding 23 Chinese swimmers accountable to the rules, like everyone else should be held accountable, regardless if they're from or what level of sport they're in.
My final question is kind of an overarching one, the whole doping scene at the moment. Against the backdrop of these Kenyan busts that are happening all the time, just looking at your experience, having been there for over 20 years, is doping winning? The anti-doping community and organizations winning? Or is it a continuous case of losing this battle against the dopers?
Well, listen, we have to fight every day to win. Like that is without question. There is no choice. I think, unfortunately, not everybody is fighting to win the battle for clean athletes. They're more preoccupied with the politics or being comfortable or whatever it may be. And that's really sad. We need people in these roles who are going to, not fear or favor, but enforce the rules on principle and be dogged in protecting clean athletes. If we want something different, if we want the appearance of cleanliness and we want the charade and we want it for brand purposes only, then let's agree to that. Let's agree that winning the right way is not the most important. And let's let athletes know that. And then those of us who are here actually to do the job, like USADA and our board and our staff, to actually tell athletes when we look at them, we're doing everything we can. So you keep doing everything you can to be clean.
So let's rephrase it. Do you feel USADA is winning what the battle that you are waging against?
Listen, we're fighting to win. I hope we give hope to clean athletes and that the bias has changed for them, that they have hope that they can win clean in the right way. And if not, we're all ears of what we can do to do that.
Yeah. Ross, final question? Or do you have one?
No.
I think
here's
we're
one
good.
that you answer really short, Travis. What percentage?
Don't wore me out.
athletes
This
would
was
you
supposed
say
to be
are
like
doping?
30 minutes, right? I think we've gone like an hour and a half.
Yeah, actually, you're right. Let me not ask for that commitment.
Travis Tygart, thanks very much for your time, and very fascinating interviewing with you. But thanks very much for your time all the way from the States. Thank you.
Well, really appreciate this and appreciate what you do. And look, hopefully one point is come across very clear. The society in large part has lost the ability to have civil discussion and disagreement. And, these type of environments where we can have different opinions, hopefully based on facts and, accurate data is really important. So thanks for what you guys do. And we're happy to join again at any point. I'll just block out more time next time. All right.
Thanks, Travis.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, guys. All right. Take care.
Well, lots to digest there in the interview with Travis Tygart, and we thank him very much for his time. He was based in the States, in mountain time in the States. We were here in South Africa, so we were doing in the evening. He was early morning kind of thing. But lots of controversy, and at the end there's some quite fiery comments about the IOC and their link with WADA and suggestions that there is some sort of, not collusion, but that Olympics need to protect themselves and make sure everybody's participating in the games. WADA's essentially taken Russia out of the games of the last decade or so. They don't want that to happen again. All those sort of things. So there's lots of things in play at the moment.
Yeah, Tygart doesn't exactly pull a punch. He said that at one point he'd been sued by WADA, and that was for the comments he made about the Chinese case. Because in fact, Fahanda, as he called it at the time, he called it a crushing revelation and accused WADA of sweeping positives under the carpet and all those with dirty hands bearing positive tests. So that's the sort of stuff that got him then sued. They ended up withdrawing it, but he's stuck to his guns, right? And he's pulled the trigger more than once, even in that interview. And I thought it was quite astonishing, the IOC slapping WADA down for calling for the ban of Russia.
Yeah.
Because it kind of brings us back, right at the beginning. Do you remember Tygart talks about a fox guarding the hen house? We end this interview in the same place, of a fox guarding the hen house. And is that fox the IOC, and by virtue of their instruction and funding to WADA? And I think that's the thing about the whole anti-doping model, is it asks countries, national anti-doping agencies, and sports to go after their own. And the disincentive to catch a doper is strong when that happens, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the root causes that I got out of this interview with him was, how do you fix something where you'd incriminate not yourself, but and we've seen this so often. Like, would Spanish anti-doping have wanted in the Operation Puerto affair to make all those tests public? Of course not. It's in their best interest because they're getting their money from the Spanish Olympic Committee and they want medals, not dopers.
Yeah.
But it needs dopers to win medals. So now what do you do?
Yeah.
So it's the fox guarding the hen house, and Travis Tygart has pretty much told us at the end that he believes that the fox was the IOC, and now it might be WADA. And I don't know. I thought it was some astonishing things that he said, and so interesting to get a peek behind that particular curtain. Absolutely fascinating.
So what we're going to attempt to do, and we have already put those wheels in motion even before we did the interview with Travis, was to try and get WADA on our podcast. We're still going to try and do that because we feel that we need a right of reply from them. We have the AIU, the Athletics Integrity, is it AIU?
Integrity Unit.
Sorry. They're also due to be up on our podcast in the next couple of weeks, so we get some amazing insight from them as well.
Yeah.
And this is part of I reckon a special on the doping situation in the world, because as I said right at the start of this podcast, Ross, it's critical that we can't just say, oh, it's doping, we're tired of the story, because it is critical to the integrity of sport that people hope that the battle is being won. At the moment, the battle is being divided, but hopefully it's still being won in some way.
Yeah, it's kind of like the ever-present shadow, you know? And I think on this podcast, we made a call very early on that we wouldn't keep coming back to it.
No.
Because otherwise, every time we discuss a great performance, whether it's a marathon world record or a cycling victory or something, you got to say, but hang on, let's deviate for 10 minutes to talk about all our suspicion and skepticism. And that's no way to watch and enjoy sport. So we have made a call to sort of let me say it this way, to put reality aside a little bit. At some point, you also got to put reality front and center. And that's what this series is designed to do. So, yeah, we're really grateful that Travis Tygart was the first of those, but there'll be others. Mm-hmm. I will say this, though. Do you get the sense, when you hear him talk, I get the sense that this is a guy who I would really believe in if I was an athlete.
Yes.
If he was on my side.
Yes.
And that's what, yeah. This is a guy who I don't think anyone can question his integrity and his principles.
100%. Yeah,
it's clear.
He is the sheriff for me. I mean, as much as we've joked about it during this podcast, he is the sheriff. He's the kind of guy that protects the town.
And we do mean that as a positive. It's a compliment.
Absolutely.
He asked that, and we did.
Yeah.
We're going to clarify that.
And there's no doubt that his personality gets up the nose of WADA, and we know, and we talked about a lot of American influence affecting people. Don't like American influence dominating the world.
That's
we
clear.
know that is clear, and this is becoming evident in this dispute as well.
So that's definitely colouring the way that WADA have reacted to it. I think it's obvious. So that's the one thing I think is a given. Number is his integrity and their principles. Number two is this is not a good situation, the fight between these unions, these organizations.
No.
And like even when we look at the Reuters and the use by USADA of those undercover athletes, dopers and so on, WADA saying we didn't permit it, Tygart saying they did. It's so confusing. And what anti-doping needs less of is confusion. It needs much more clarity. And so, like, I totally understand his frustration, and I think I also would get WADA's frustrations with it. But I just hope that these parties can sit down and sort this out, because what's currently happening is in their quest and their well-intentioned approach to anti-doping, I think it's undermining it.
Yeah. And it doesn't look like it's going to resolve itself anytime soon.
No. And that's why I asked him, like someone, like with most relationships that are failing, that it's not going to be fixed without compromise. And I don't know where that comes from, but I hope it
both
does.
sides,
I hope it does, because the anti-doping world could do with more of Tygart's approach in terms of the principle integrity, but the political situation around it is not good.
Yeah.
So I hope that, hey, maybe this podcast is going to bring them to the table. We're going to claim credit for it.
Or take them to a marriage counselor.
Yeah, that's what it needs. It definitely does need that, because it's quite clear that it just needs to be tidied up, and we need everyone pulling on the same rope, not in opposite directions.
Yeah. If you enjoyed our podcast, don't forget you can support us on Patreon. You go to the patreon.com website, look for The Real Science of Sport. And if you become a member of our Patreon supporters group, you can then get access to our absolutely amazing Discourse channel, where our Mayor of Discourse, Gareth, is on there pretty much every day and making sure the discussions are fruitful and great. I know Ross is on there pretty much every day as well. And some of the best minds in sports science around the world are contributing to some of the discussions on there. So that's a little added bonus to just the podcasts we do. There's way more to our little business than just that. So if you've enjoyed it, get on there and support us. But until next time, it's goodbye.
You have been listening to the Science of Sport podcast.